My HS358D students, this is your Professor Donald Earl Collins. It's always hard for me to remember the D part. Who labeled this course? Anyway, it's week 9 and we are, in the thick of things. We're coming out from under the writing assignment process and into the freestyle assignment project and project proposal and so on and so forth. So here we are. I am most of the way through both classes in African American history regarding writing assignment. About 3/4 of the way through your essays. I will not get them done in time for Tuesday. There's just no way. There's just simply not enough time in the day for me to get them done today, especially if I'm commenting on them, right? If you just want me to slap a grade on them, I could probably finish them all on easily, probably by Wednesday morning. But if I'm actually going to tell you, well, here's what you did, here's what you didn't do, all that other stuff, that's going to take some time. I'll have them done in time for class on Thursday. That much I am certain of. Knock on wood. Thursday by November 3rd, I'll be able to give you extensive feedback. But what I can tell you in general is the same thing I said in classes on Thursday. And most of you did not write opinion pieces. Most of you did not write big idea pieces. Most of you did not write personal essays. There were attempts to do those things, but in the end, mostly what people ended up writing were book reports or book reviews. Some book reports basically not much better than the equivalent of a book report for middle school or the start of high school, to be perfectly honest. Book reviews, which are more sophisticated, or critiques that include historical context, that sort of thing. I saw some of that. I also see quite a few term papers there, which is fine. I mean, in the whole scheme of things, it's not what I want, but if you wrote a good term paper, you got a good grade on it, that kind of thing. I didn't take points off. I did take some points off because you didn't do the assignment as designed, but I didn't. It wasn't going to be the difference between something in the A range or something in the B range. Basically, if you were going to get an A minus versus an A, a B plus versus an A minus, and so on and so forth, which will probably be made up in the end with a curve, right? So you'll get some of those points back once I curve all the grades. But aside from that, there's a lot more I could comment on. I just will not have the time in the video to comment on all of it. For those of you who missed deadlines, you lost points. Some of you tried to sneak things in past the deadline and acted as if it was a Moodle issue, when in point of fact you just simply didn't submit it on time. And for some of those folks, you've lost 11 points. There weren't a lot of those in my African American history classes, but there were a few. Maybe 3 or 4. There are also a couple of you who have zeros because you did not submit your final draft within the week of the deadline. There are a couple of you who haven't been to class or haven't been to class very much over the past 5 or 6 weeks for whatever reason. But if you don't talk to me, if you don't come to me and say, hey, I've got these issues going, I mean, heck, you don't even have to tell me what the issues are. You can just simply say, I'm bogged down. I can't get this work done. Can I have an extension? If you had done that at some point, met with me at some point in the last 3, 4, or 5 weeks around these issues, we could have worked something out where maybe you wouldn't be losing any points. And so I'm sorry to say that there are a couple of people who do have zeros. I don't like giving out zeros. I don't like failing anybody, to be perfectly honest with you. But I really loathe I mean, well, I don't loathe teaching. I don't loathe grading as a teacher. I loathe grading as an instructor, but it is the job. And so, and it's done without personal malice or without, hatred, really. I'm following a rubric and I'm following what you're supposed to be doing, what I've been telling you to do. And if you're not doing it, and if you're not doing it in a timely manner, you just decide that you want to do stuff when you want to. I mean, this isn't, Grand Canyon University. This, it's supposed to be something akin to college in real life. And while I want to be flexible, I also have the fact that I've got 100 other students between 4 classes and 2 different courses I have to watch out for. And if I'm setting a standard, the standard's got to be for everybody. I can't be making an exception every time someone has an issue, and certainly make exceptions that mean that other people who did do the work um, get a lower grade than you would end up getting simply because of the fact that they actually followed the instructions. So no, I'm not giving out extra credit or makeups or anything along those lines unless there are some serious extenuating circumstances for me to do so, and I haven't seen that with the folks I'm dealing with over the last few days. So I do plan on having all this graded by Wednesday, up by the time we meet Thursday afternoon. Hopefully, I can go over in more detail, some of the common issues that everyone had. So there's that. Um, I will, as a result of all this grading I've been doing, I will probably not start grading and reading the freestyle assignment project proposals until Friday and over the weekend. Now, there will be less of those and they're shorter, so I'll probably be able to get through all of them by the time Monday rolls around. So you'll still have plenty of time to do your work. And my suggestion to those of you who are nervous about whether I will accept the project or not, do not be nervous. Start your project. Start it. If you're a group, start meeting, start talking about what you're going to be doing for this project, what you need to look up, what you need in terms of research, and so on. If you are an individual, start your research. If you're doing an individual project, if there is something really truly wrong, I will let you know, right? But don't not start your project because I might come in. There's a possibility. There's always a possibility, but given the scope of what I've given you, if you've at all been listening to what I'm saying, unless it's completely out of range or offensive, I'm going to say yes to it. And by offensive, I hope no one's doing the Confederate flag and how the Confederate flag is a wonderful thing for people to celebrate in the South, despite the anti-black racism contained within the symbol of the Confederacy, right? If you're doing that, then I'm probably saying no. But short of that, you're going to be okay. So there's that. And then in terms of meetings virtually, we're definitely meeting on November 8th virtually. It's election day. I want everybody to vote. As many people should vote, particularly younger adults. Under 30 adults are notoriously bad at voting during midterms. It's historically bad. I used to be one of y'all. I know, because I didn't vote very much. I voted. I voted in elections. I voted in presidential elections. I voted for governor of New York in 1990, but I skipped out on midterms for the most part. I skipped out on midterms in 1990. Skipped out on, I think I might have voted in midterms in 1994. Yeah, I was mediocre in terms of that until 1998, and I was almost 30 then. So yes, don't go to vote, and so we're going virtual. We might do it on Thursday, depending on attendance tomorrow. We'll see. I will knock on wood be in for do classes on Tuesday, November the 1st. So there's that. Let's see. So most of what I want to concentrate on for the next 15 or 18 minutes is talking to you about week 9. And week 9 is really about a continuation of things that we've talked about in previous weeks, only in the antebellum period, what becomes known as the antebellum period of U.S. history, the period between roughly 1830 and 1860, the 30 years before the start of the Civil War. And in those 30 years, all the stuff that we've talked about in the last few weeks regarding the brutality of slavery, regarding resistance to slavery, regarding open rebellion against slavery, regarding the abolitionist movement, regarding the status of free black folk living outside of the South, and then some pockets of the South, all of it becomes heightened in this period, in the period before the Civil War. All of it becomes heightened. So there is, in fact, more resistance. And the number one way that people resist in this period is this newfangled system that people have cobbled together known as the Underground Railroad. Yes, we've talked about this ad nauseum through the book The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. Only the real Underground Railroad is not an actual railroad. It might involve using railroads to get out of the South, but it is not a railroad. It's actually a system in which people who are escaping slavery find their way to safe houses, to barns, to, in some cases, tunnels, to attics, to places in cities and in other country across the countryside throughout the South on their way out of slave states to freedom, so to speak, in Pennsylvania or in upstate New York or in New York City or in Philadelphia or in the Midwest to places like Chicago, eventually places like Detroit and other, or smaller places. But in many, many cases, those folks make their way all the way to Canada. Something like 100,000 enslaved black folk made their way out of the South, um, to freedom, to some sort of freedom that wasn't slavery, in the period between 1800 and 1860. 30,000 of them in the 20 years between 1840 and 1860, as things escalated um, during the antebellum period in terms of trying to protect slavery. In the South, so these people are making their way up north, which means way more than 100,000 try to escape. Keep this in mind. If 100,000 try to escape, you probably can double, triple, quadruple that into the numbers of people who try to escape, which is basically 10% of the enslaved population in the South try to escape. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people, and so many of them made their way through. Harriet Tubman being among the most famous of them. Frederick Douglass being another famous person among them. So many made their way through. But 40% of those people ultimately moved to Canada. So many people who live in Canada who are the descendants of escaped enslaved people are, we know of some of these people. If you followed sports at all in the last 30 years, we know people, the late, guy was a sportscaster for ESPN for years and years, Canadian, right? But he's a descendant of folks who were enslaved, who escaped. There's so many of folks who, are black Canadians, but those black Canadians, their roots were originally from the U.S. South. Of course, there are Afro-Caribbeans living in Canada. There are Africans living, black Africans from the continent living in Canada. But there are tens of thousands of descendants of these people, if not hundreds of thousands living in Canada at this point. So there's that. And so when you start talking about resistance, it's brutal. So everything we've talked about, rape, we've talked about beatings and mutilations and pedophilia and so many other ills that slavery allows folks with absolute power to act on, gets heightened in this period, where there's also the constant worry of slave revolts as a result of Nat Turner's rebellion, as a result of the Haitian Revolution, as a result of other planned rebellions. People are Southerners in particular are hyper vigilant. And one of the results of all of this is that you have not just slave catchers around, not just people with guns, but the entire South is militarized in some ways. In fact, you could argue that the militarization of the South, particularly during the antebellum period, is the way the South has been since. The South in the United States is pretty much the most militarized part of our country, right? In terms of arresting people, in terms of um, dealing with people in prison or in jail, in terms of all of it. And it's a result of the not just blatant racism, but the heightened awareness that people might rebel against this racism, against tyranny, against oppression. And so there's always this willingness to brutally put down anything, any opposition, in fascist sort of ways, in far right sorts of ways, toward free blacks, which is why so many free blacks are driven out of the South, and against enslaved people especially. So there's that side of things, right? But also the resistance, whether it's individualized resistance, gets worse. Slave owners they're being murdered on a regular basis by enslaved people. People being poisoned, all of that. So just imagine, you know, basically our country violent, but every week is January 6th. Right? Every week is January 6th, and every day is George Floyd. Every day. Not some days, not the summer months. Every day. There are just, you know, there are 10, 20 George Floyds a day. We don't. There aren't 20 killings of African Americans filmed where African Americans have necks their necks sat on by somebody's full weight on a knee, right? But if you had 20 of those every single day, imagine the amount of resistance you would have. Maybe you can't organize an out-and-out slave revolt because it'll be squashed before it happens, but you can certainly have, 10 people decide that today's the day they're burning down the mansion. Today's the day they're burning down the big house. And so all of that's part and parcel of what's happening in the South in this period. But it's not just all of that. And it's not even just the Underground Railroad. Because the Underground Railroad, yes, involves black folks and free blacks, but it also involves white folks who are abolitionists. And what's one of the ways the abolitionist movement really takes off is that some of these, white Americans decide that they want to do something, not just issue rhetoric, but do something in terms of that. And so a lot of these safe houses, particularly in border states like Kentucky and Ohio and Illinois and Indiana and even Missouri, have some white people attached to it. They're not a lot of them, right? But there are enough of them to where it helps 100,000, enslaved black folks to escape, to steal their own bodies. So that's great. That's one of the stories. But let's not make them all out to be saints. These people don't believe in black equality. Ultimately, 40% of these escapees managed to make their way to Canada, because ultimately they couldn't guarantee their freedom, even if they wanted to guarantee their freedom, especially once the Fugitive Slave Act passes in 1850, making pretty much every white person complicit, not just courts, but complicit in directly being involved in the recapture and the re-enslavement of escaped slaves. So there's that. Right? But that's not the only thing that's happening, right? There's also this thing known as the abolitionist movement, the William Lloyd Garrison abolitionist movement that also takes off the same year as Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. It expands over time to where it's not just white people talking about, the moral and legal horrors of slavery, right? And even economic horrors of slavery. But you start seeing black folks take this platform on too, particularly people like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, right? Once Frederick Douglass becomes the great orator that he becomes in the 1830s and 40s, because he learned how to read and write. His master, who is basically his dad, taught him how to read and write. And nevertheless, despite all the good things that his father did for him, he was also a slave owner, and he also got beat by this guy. And so eventually he escapes. But he's able to take his knowledge, his sense of oratory, and use it to talk about ending slavery, not just in the United States. He goes on speaking towards the United States when he publishes his memoirs about being enslaved in 1844 and 1845. But he also goes across the ocean to the UK in Europe to do exactly the same thing. He becomes an international star as a result of this. Sojourner Truth, who's often misquoted in Ain't I a Woman, because that's not what she actually said. I'll talk about that more, hopefully on Thursday, definitely so on next Tuesday. And talks about the role of women in the abolitionist movement, and quite frankly, the role of black women in the women's suffrage movement, right? And how, basically the first speech ever on intersectionality really is Sojourner Truth's speech about how, I'm as strong as a black man when it comes to doing, enslaved person's work, but I'm ignored. I am a woman, but I'm, not allowed to speak at the convention that's supposed to be about women's suffrage, but the only women speaking are white. She's really being intersectional, talking about all of this, and this is 1851, right? The term intersectional doesn't even exist, but she's doing intersectional work, which is great. So so you got the abolitionist movement that's really gearing up in this antebellum period as well. The response of Southerners to this is multifold. I cannot possibly go through all the different ways of their response, but the key, besides the militarization of the South, the creation of the Citadel, VMI in 1851, and militarization in a literal sense, in the sense of being vigilant against folks who are trying to escape slavery, being vigilant against slave revolts and the rumors of slave revolts, being vigilant in driving free blacks out of cities and out of free black neighborhoods as far as you can. I mean, New Orleans is an exception, Atlanta is an exception. There are other exceptions where there's still free black communities, but for the most part, there aren't a whole lot of free black communities in cities throughout the South because those are good places to organize, organize slave revolts. So there's that. But the other way is at the federal level, right? Particularly at the federal level. In 1836, Congress passes a resolution known as a gag resolution, where for the next 8 years after that, the issue of slavery the word slavery can't even be mentioned in the House or Senate chambers. No one can talk about slavery. So abolitionists who come to speak, they can't do hearings on slavery, they can't talk about abolition, they can't even use the word slavery, otherwise you'll be censured, right? You could even be thrown out of Congress for that. So, and when it finally starts up in 1844, it's mostly about the expansion of slavery to new territories gained as a result of the Mexican-American War, which puts things in real perspective because when that happens and the country really expands itself all the way from sea to shining sea, fulfilling the manifest destiny that God so ordained apparently that this country would actually occupy land bordering two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. Once that happens, once Texas is annexed in 1845, once the U.S. wins the Mexican-American War, once it settles territorial disputes with the UK and Canada, right? It's from sea to shining sea, and it opens up all kinds of areas for folks to move enslaved people too. So Congress passes a compromise in 1850 when California fills up as a result of the 1849 gold rush that basically allows slavery to expand to territories west of not just west of the Mississippi, but west of Texas. So like folks brought 3,000 enslaved blacks to Arizona, New Mexico in the 1850s to grow cotton. There was the hope that some of these folks would end up in California until California said, nope, we're not going to be a slave state, right? Nevada, there are handfuls of folks in Nevada, there are handfuls of folks in Colorado Territory, enslaved folks. So this is an era where you've got, because you've been kicking the can down the road, you've got folks vehemently opposed to slavery with folks who are vehemently supportive of it at the same time. And this cannot continue. This cannot continue. This is why it's the antebellum period. You can't have a country that is literally going, no, slavery is wrong. Keep in mind, the abolitionist movement and the pro-slavery movement are not even. Most people in the country don't care about slavery at all. They don't care. They do not care. But the abolitionist movement is a growing movement. The pro-slavery movement is not a growing movement, right? The people who believed in slavery are the same people who believed in slavery before the antebellum period, right? It's the same group of people. And Northerners, particularly Northerners in the business of making money, understand that they're dependent on slavery, but they don't want to be. They actually don't want to be dependent on slavery anymore because they've got wage laborers that they don't have to even take care of. They don't even have to provide housing for. They don't even have to feed. So what if they starve to death? That's even easier than enslaving people. You don't have to find them, buy them, sell them, transport them, and listen to all their sorrows and bitterness about being enslaved. So in that sense, that's the reason why they want to move on from slavery. They don't care that the folks are actually suffering from slavery, that enslaved blacks are suffering. They care more about their profit margin and the ability not to have to take care of people. So there is that. But the truth of the matter is that because of the escalation of things that's happening in terms of resistance to slavery, in terms of the abolitionist movement, Southerners in particular dig in their heels about protecting the institution, talking about it being their way of life, trying to give scientific and religious and other kinds of reasons for protecting the institution. And in doing so, they actually bring more people on the side of getting rid of slavery as an institution, including one Abraham Lincoln, who actually at one point in time was pro-slavery. So that's pretty much not week 9, but takes us into week 10 as well. So I will stop here.